Thank you, everyone, for braving. It's crazy to say this this late in the year, but thank you for braving the winter weather. Um, and I know there are interesting things happening elsewhere at NYU at all times, and I really appreciate you making the time to come to this evening's talk. Tonight, we're having it's one of my very favorite people in the planet come give a talk this evening. I've been a huge fan of Raquel Rolnik for a long, long time. She is someone whose writing, whose activism, whose courage I find tremendously inspiring. There's a quality to her work that I always aspire to and I point people to, which is she does not make the false choice between criticism and engagement. She is a radical critic, and she's radically engaged in her practice as an urban planner and as a scholar. Raquel, I learned tonight, to my great pleasure, is actually an NYU alum. This is the first time she's coming back to NYU after formally completing her dissertation in history, which made me very pleased. She's very well regarded author of several books and articles, many of which have set the debate for us who work on Latin America. She's had a number of posts. She was director of planning in the 1989-1992 underappreciated administration of municipality of São Paulo. She was National Secretary for Urban Programs in the Brazilian Ministry of Cities in 2003 and 2007. She was the Urban Policy Coordinator of Polis from 1997 to 2002. And she continues to be active nationally and internationally. And in 2008, at the 7th session of the Human Rights Council, Raquel Rolnik was appointed the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing as a component of the right to an adequate standard of living and the right to non-discrimination in this context. This is a lot of words, but it's a very, very important job. And she held this post until 2014. Raquel is here tonight as guest of the Gallatin School. She was asking me what the Gallatin School is, and I have to repeat this joke because I don't see too much overlap from the last time I said this. Gallatin is the Uruguay of NYU. So NYU is a large university with lots of things happening, a big ball, and we're a small speck of dust the size of Uruguay, but we practice direct democracy here at Gallatin School. We do very interesting things, and we try to be a laboratory in forward thinking. She is hosted by the Urban Democracy Lab, which is an initiative of the Gallatin School. The Urban Democracy Lab has as its mission to promote scholarship, teaching, curricular activities, and public programming around alternative imaginings of the city. And her talk tonight is part of the Distinguished Faculty Lecture Series at Gallatin. The purpose of this lecture series is to foster spaces of intellectual exchange with renowned scholars and practitioners, and we look for speakers like Raquel who honor Gallatin's commitments to interdisciplinary study and excellence in intellectual, civic, and aesthetic endeavors, and whose work or practice has made an outstanding contribution to one or more of these areas. So please welcome Raquel Rolnik.
Thank you. Let me just put here. So, good evening, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank very, very much for the Urban Democracy Lab, for Professor Gianpaolo Baiocchi for this very kind invitation, for this opportunity of what I hope will be an interaction and a dialogue among us. Before I start with my talk, I have to tell you that everything that I'm going to show here today has to do with my last assignment, my last professional. I'm currently, and I have ever been, a professor in the University of São Paulo in the Architecture and Urban Planning School. But for the last 6 years, I was the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. And on this regard, I had the opportunity to travel around the world, to do missions in countries in order to investigate the implementation of the right to adequate housing as a human right, the state of implementation of the right to adequate housing as one of the economic, social, and cultural rights that were established in the international covenants and pacts on human rights. And that gave me an opportunity, which for me was very, very precious, to really engage with the people who were, of course, suffering violations of their right to adequate housing, but also not only with them, but with governments, with academics, with people who are thinking about this issue as well. So what I'm going to try to bring here is an overview, almost a video clip of what I have seen in the world in the last 6 years. And I had the chance, and it's not very nice to say that, just 1 year after I started my mandate, we had the subprime crisis in the US. So I had the chance to follow the subprime crisis, and that opened for me an opportunity to talk about housing and the problems of adequate housing, not only in southern countries, non-developed countries, which the housing question is more evident, like Latin American countries, African countries, some Asian countries, but also to talk about that in Europe, in the US as well. So I think what I'm going to show here is much more the links between those issues instead of the differences between those issues. That's what it's my intention. Urban warfare, the colonization of urban land and housing under the empire of finance, is more or less, for me, a metaphor of everything that I have had the opportunity to see in the last years. And this image, which is an image of Astana, the new capital of Kazakhstan, Central Asia, former Soviet country, former socialist country, and you're gonna understand later on during my lecture why I started with this image of this newly built 10 years old, 15 years old new capital of capitalist Kazakhstan. Here is Kazakhstan as well. And this is a hunger strike of thousands of people that were owners of apartments, deprived from their promised apartments, apartments that they paid for in installments, in small installments, but apartments that were never delivered by the contractors afterwards, especially after the financial crisis, the economic crisis that followed in 2008, 2010. And the scene in Kazakhstan, it's not different from the scenes that we have seen also in the United States, where millions indebted or foreclosed homeowners, subprime victims of the credit boom that we had here. And it's not different at all from the scenes we had in Spain. And this is one of the protests of the Plataforma de los Afectados por las Hipotecas, which is exactly the people that not only had lost their apartments that they paid by credit and they were pushed toward buying them, not only are homeless, but also they are homeless and still have to pay the debt with the banks. So this is one of the organizations that was fighting in the last years against this situation. And this other picture is a camping in Dizengoff Street, the main Tel Aviv Avenue, Boulevard, also on housing, with young people protesting. Oh yes, this is a picture of Israel, but we are not talking about Gaza, we are not talking about Palestinian conflict, we are talking about a very acute housing shortage for young Israelis that cannot afford to have houses anymore in a country like previous ones, like US, like other countries, like even Kazakhstan, the cases that I have shown, that some years before, almost everybody had a chance to have access to some kind of shelter, some kind of homes. Rental housing, normally, not privately owned, not every time in a very good conditions, not every time in a very good shape, but had opportunity to have access to those homes. And this is an image from in the UK, I think it's Liverpool, but I might be wrong. Maybe it's another city in England. And it's a protest against cuts in housing allowances, parts of very, very huge cuts in the welfare systems, the UK welfare systems, that now affects also the housing sector. And it's a protest against the bedroom tax. So the bedroom tax was a law that have passed that all the people that were living in public housing, public rental housing, if they have an extra room, which means if it was a couple and it had, instead of 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, they had to pay an extra money in order to stay there or to move elsewhere to a smaller apartment. Smaller apartments that don't exist. So they basically lost more money in order to stay sometimes in the apartments that they used to live for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, the whole family. And we are talking about also a protest against the bedroom tax here. And this, we change our scene to Mexico. Mexico City, and this is the newly built houses built by private market to be bought by the people with state subsidies. And you can see very clearly here, I don't need any explanation about the location of these houses. They are in the middle, basically in the middle of nowhere. There is no city, there is no shops, there is no buses, there is no nothing. And this is part of the new scheme of housing produced by private market promoting home ownership. This is also, all of them are images of this new program in Mexico. And part of these scenes that I put together with the protest scenes over the housing shortage of the last years is because a great number of those houses, as well as similar situations in Spain, as well as similar situations in China, are empty. And nobody is living there anymore. So we have a huge surplus of houses being produced and not exactly, and a lot of people still homeless. So we are talking about different scenes in different places. So what happened? And what is the link between all these very, very different situations around the world? What happened is that, fed by pension funds, private equities, hedge funds, and other fictitious commodities, housing became a fictitious commodity itself, when housing was taken over by finance. So housing has been the most powerful new frontier of late neoliberalism during the decades of economic boom, and it was converted into the main Keynesian strategies to recover from the crisis as well. Backed by the political force of the home ownership ideology, which is deeply rooted in some societies and recently adopted by others, and by the idea of socialization of credit, which means credit finally for all, what is the inclusion of middle and low-income consumers into financial circuits, the taking over of the housing sector by global finance opened a new frontier of capital accumulation, but impacted as well, as we will see later on this lecture, on urban restructuring, cleaning up high-valued land from low-rent extraction uses, and imposing its logic on urban planning as well. Not by chance, the scenes of protests in Istanbul, as well as in Rio, São Paulo, and other recent Brazilian cities over the right to the city were also part of the last decade urban upheavals. What I have just described is a path-dependent paradigm shift initiated by Wall Street, the City of London, and liberal US and UK politicians, but spread out everywhere, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall, whether voluntarily decided by government or imposed by international financial institutions as loan, like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, which converted housing from a social good to be provided and cared of by the state into a commodity and a financial asset. And that was a global paradigm shift everywhere, everywhere. The idea, in some countries, of course, this was a reality. The state was a provider of housing in very significant numbers. For instance, UK or Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, France, you have very wide schemes of social housing. In other countries, like most of Latin American countries, this was not a reality, was a dream, was an idea. But it was there, the idea that housing was part of the commonalities that a society wants to provide and share among those who don't have. So this was over. And now the idea of housing is something that you just buy, it's private, you buy, you sell, and more than that, it's something that is very important in order to insert the household, the family, into the financial circuit, and that provides the household and the family more consumption power. I'm going to explain a little bit more on that. In 1993, a World Bank very influential report, and the name is Housing Enabling Markets to Work, summarized the new thinking based on this idea. And then since the 90s, housing finance has increased dramatically. In the US, UK, Denmark, Australia, Japan, residential mortgage markets have now converted into more than 50% of the country's GDPs. So it's very significant economic sector of those countries. The process can be described as a general process of dismantling public and social housing policy, destabilizing of rent security of tenure, and at the same time the commodification of housing and a general trend towards transferring state debt to households debt. So this is more clear, for instance, in the UK and in some European countries that had very strong welfare states from the 30s, 40s, and the 50s, with housing as one component. So what happened there, and also in the socialist countries as well, was massive privatization of the public housing stock and the conversion of homes into assets that has provided to families in times of less power of unions and lower wages of the working class, an instrument to finance private services once provided by the state, such as health and education. Many of you probably know how this works. You mortgage your home in order to get a loan in a bank to fund the education of your kid or to fund the health care of the family or of the elders. So it's a way of making money out of it in times where wages were depressed and controlled. But also consumption goods like cars. In US, where the expansion of home ownership through credit has been one of the housing policies foundation since the 30s of the last century. So it's very different from UK, because here, from the beginning, housing policies had two lines. One was promoting home ownership through credit, and this is a very long story of doing that, through tax exemptions, basically. So it's a lot of public money put into that. And the other tier was, and that was very significant, to build public housing for rent for those who didn't have the chance or the will to get to home ownership. Subsidized rental housing. But this subsidized rental housing was just stopped in the 70s, and more public housing became more dilapidated, more and more became less invested in terms of investment in maintenance, in a way that in many countries, this is not the case of New York, but I say New York is really an exception on this regard. Here in the US, most of the public housing were demolished afterwards and eventually replaced by mixed income, but with less and less numbers and apartments. So a lot of people just lost any chance to get a subsidized rental apartment. The central idea behind subprime credit, which was creative mortgage products in order to include those who were discriminated by finance, was what I call the genie out of the bottle. These words were taken from a World Bank report of 2006, who has transformed, and again I am quoting, a sleeping beauty into a fantastic ballet. What is this sleeping beauty? The sleeping beauty is a metaphor for both the new markets of low-income households opened by the adoption of these very creative mortgage products, and Spain, Ireland, and US are good examples of that, which has increased enormously during the 90s and 2000s. But also for the new mechanisms of housing delivery in countries of the South, marked by the hegemonic presence of informal settlements. Chile, during Pinochet, the dictatorship of Pinochet times, provided the laboratory for these neoliberal housing policies in context of a large proportion of low-income and informal settlers. And under this scheme, which is different from mortgage products, is a different type of financialization, direct subsidies were provided to families willing to enter into financial discipline in order to get their freehold homes. The mechanism was useful both to empty Chilean campamentos, the bedrock for socialist activism in Allende times, as well as expanding real estate and housing markets in a very rapid pace. Several Latin American countries, such as more recently Mexico and Brazil, followed the exact same path. What is the path? Infused by the stock exchange financial funds, contractors were able to produce massively, buying non-developed land in the outskirts, and this is exactly the image of this, in the outskirts of the city, where there are no jobs, no economic opportunities, no cultural opportunities, no cities, creating ghettos of homogeneous low-income housing. Moreover, and this is exactly the same thing of Mexico, exactly the same thing of the program Minha Casa Minha Vida in Brazil, and we can give you hundreds of examples. South Africa, the same thing, the same type, same line of issue. Moreover, the integration of housing finance markets within general financial circuits means that individual owners are competing with multinational corporations for location, with an obvious centrifuge effect that led in metropolitan areas as different as those as Madrid, Mexico City, Istanbul, Santiago, a new form of segregation. So now is the connections between this massive production of housing in the middle of nowhere or in the outskirts, and then the restructuring, the internal restructuring, internal urban restructuring of the cities. As a result of what we have presented so far, the exposure of vulnerable households to speculative game of finance has deeply impacted their lives, created indebted or foreclosured men and women, or disrupting communities and entire neighborhoods, besides the millions of inhabitants that have that had connections with the land they used to live, sometimes for more than a century, were removed or displaced due to a process of land grabbing, urban renewal, natural disasters, reconstruction after disaster, using the opportunity of disasters in order to get rid of the poor from very very good locations in city, under the driving force of the planning mantra. What is the planning mantra of 21st century? Unlock land value, which means that the best use for land is the one that increases the possibility of restructuring. It's not the one that provides more comfort or well-being for more people, but it's the one that provides the best output for the financial capital to come there and extract rent in a compound way. So this, of course, the impact of this logic, and now we go into a different situation, which is the situation of southern countries where informal settlements were the mark of the city and where the majority of the people used to live. So the territories occupied by the so-called informal settlements, and this is Indonesia, a city in Indonesia, and I apologize for using the expression informal settlement, because in the absence of a better definition, because under the idea of informal settlement, we are talking about many different types of organization, territorial organization. And it's very, I think, rude to call it, to label everything as informal settlement. And there is sometimes a lot of formalities within as well. But those informal settlements, they have been always the other in the city, victims of a discriminatory planning or a juridical or ethnical or administrative systems, or all of them at once. They are under this context more than ever under attack, this type of organization, this type of life. This is a very traditional community in Yogi River in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. They are there, I think, for 400 years, this community in this location. And now, because of this central location, because of the whole process that I have been described, this type of occupation in the center of city is more than ever under attack, because the type of tenure that you have here, it's not individual freehold, which corresponds to the international language of finance. If during Fordist capitalism they were the industrial army reserve, and we know well this story in many, many countries of migration, rural, urban migration, people that migrate to the city in order to work there, in order to get jobs, and the fantastic machinery of doing informal settlement as a way to have this reserve of industrial labor, very cheap, and not having to spend a lot of money for the people in order to them to get housing, because everybody made the house themselves, basically, without any resources. So that was very useful during Fordist capitalism. They were the industrial army reserve functioning at the same time to house the poor and maintain low their wages. Now, under financialized capitalism, land has been converted into a powerful collateral, capable to leverage more credit and to offer growing payments to rent-seeking capital. So, what happened with this type of arrangements under this new sort of organization of capital? In order to do that, and this is some scenes from Cambodia, displacements of traditional communities like the ones that I were referring to, and with sometimes not always, but many, many times using violence. But in order to understand, to better understand in a very particular way, because of course I'm talking about a general trend, something planetary, but in order to understand in each particular political economy, it has complete different meanings, machineries, coalitions, why this was implemented, with whom, who gained, who not. So let's take the example of Brazil, which is my country, in order to try to understand what's going on today with this type of situation. Historically, housing solution in Brazil, in Brazilian cities, has been the self-production of the habitat of the poor by themselves. So this is one image of how it looks like. The approach of the government towards those settlements have always been very ambiguous. It was never black or white. You are legal or illegal. I will let you there, or are you removed from there? There were always been very ambiguous. Waves of repression and removal combined with drops of urbanization and consolidation, often both at the same time. The idea that the state will transform in homeowners all the dwellers of informal settlements was particularly strong in the first years of dictatorship with the organization of a housing financial system in Brazil, which it's enforced until today, backed by on compulsory savings of the workers themselves. State-owned companies that we call Coabs were responsible for building this type of housing for the poor, always in the peripheries, privately owned, selling them to a never-ending list of people, always much less than the demand, much less than the list of the waiting list. But part of the struggle for citizenship, civil and political rights, especially by the end of dictatorship, and I'm talking about late 70s of last century, early 80s of last century in Brazil, was the struggle of informal settlers to be part of the city and to be recognized as part of the city and to be fully integrated into its urban, social, and political fabric. The 1988 new constitution, the democratic constitution of Brazil, has included this claim by extending rights to informal settlers and providing instruments, planning instruments, regulatory instruments, administrative instruments to enforce those new rights. The famous Statute of the City, maybe some of you have heard about that, a national legislation adopted in Brazil in 2001, which regulated the social function of the city and property and defined participatory planning as mandatory, as well as design a special zoning for social interests in order to protect and promote social interest territories in the city, for instance, protecting this type of settlements and saying these settlements are here to stay and they should be urbanized, they should get investments in infrastructure, they should get investments in schools, they should get investments in public spaces, and the people who are living here, they have the right to stay here. So this was the type of policy that was announced by the special zoning of social interest when these settlements that once were completely absent in the planning, as if they didn't exist. So the plans were, there was green spaces or blank spaces in the places where the informal settlements were located. Now they became part of the planning, and so the announcement was, okay, you are here to stay. So the special zoning of social interest, in order to protect and promote social interest territories in the city. But all these statute of the city, these planning instruments, these administrative instruments, these regulatory instruments did not survive the economic growth of the country in the years 2000s and the hegemony of neoliberal planning, thinking and practices in Brazil. Urban mega projects implemented through public-private partnerships were particularly strengthened during the preparation for the World Cup in Brazilian cities, and in the case of Rio, which is this picture, for the World Cup and the Olympics. Informal settlements that were part of the game's scenario were either transformed to fit into the marketing landscape of a city without the poor, and I remember very well the international agenda, the idea that cities without slums, that in principle would mean in urbanize the slums, integrate the poor. Cities without slums means get rid of these slums, remove all of them from the city scenario. So some of the residents of these areas, which were part of the scenario for this marketing new city to be sold to international investors through the whole marketing operation of a World Cup and Olympics, of a mega events in general. And some of the residents were displaced. Oops. What happened? Yes. They were displaced into Minha Casa, Minha Vida housing projects. And I told you the similar projects that we had in Chile and Mexico, sometimes 30 kilometers away from the original location. In scenarios like that, pure housing, homogeneous from the point of view of income, with no stores, with no, there is a big list of no's. For those, and this is a very interesting map of Rio, the purple dots correspond all the favelas and the informal settlements that has been displaced. Sometimes not entirely, sometimes some parts of it, sometimes entirely. And the yellow spots are the new Minha Casa, Minha Vida projects and their locations. So you can, and then here in circle, we see the clusters, the Olympic clusters, and the public-private partnerships that have been implemented in the Olympic project, including the port area, the renovation of the port area. So it's clearly a movement. This movement of displacement is very clear. For those who are familiar with Rio landscape, this is a Petrobras, the oil company, advertising, very euphemistic advertise, and it's a very crucial detail. All of these hills that you can see here, they are full of favelas today. And in this image, there is no favelas at all. It's Photoshop, of course. It's Photoshop, but this is the dream of the cities without slums. The idea that almost everybody will be removed. Of course, this is impossible. We are talking about millions of people, millions of households. But this is more or less the thinking of the planning on the city, and the contracts between that and everything that was announced in the '88 Constitution, the statute of the city, the idea of integration, the idea of individuals' rights, community rights, the right to stay, the right to be urbanized. Of course, it's possible to identify similar process in São Paulo, where urban operations, big urban projects, have opened ground to a new frontier for the real estate financial complex, displacing who used to live there. And this is one case of a favela very near this new frontier of expansion. I'm going to show you so you can see more or less the new, what it looks like. Wait. But I cannot finish this talk with a pessimistic and catastrophic picture, which I have done up until now. Criticizing, saying la 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 la, it's a disaster, it's a disaster. The informal settlements that we have just shown here, this one, in this slide, was marked in the master plan in São Paulo, participatory master plan, as a special zoning of social interest. And using that, the community had organized and won in the court the right to stay in this place, in new housing, which is this one, built by the city, and this is how it looks like in the place of where this informal settlement was, to the remaining and resisting 250 households out of the 6,000 that used to live there. But at least you have here something important. What is important? What is important about that is that I can also affirm, besides all the picture that I have just shown, that the right to housing as a fundamental component of the right to the city resists through also, and you can see here, hundreds of squatters of well-located empty buildings. This is São Paulo, downtown area, centrally located, empty building because it was an area which lost its commercial centrality towards a new expansion of a new CDB, and also lost the middle class, didn't live there anymore because new neighborhoods for the middle class were also being built over several decades. So now there is more than 400 empty buildings that are squatted by a very strong social movement demanding housing. And these are different images of what is going on in São Paulo right now and the fight over that. It's not, of course, it's not without conflict, without repression, without struggle. But why I have chosen the title for my presentation, Urban Warfare, because we are not talking only about the total control of finance over the territory, but we are talking also about resistance. We are talking also about community organization. We are talking of an urban warfare. The narrative of financialization cannot overshadow the conflicts, cracks, and dissents. Being Taksim Square in Istanbul, Occupy Wall Street, or empty squatter buildings in São Paulo, or the struggles in Rio and several cities in Brazil during the World Cup, and also South Africa during the World Cup there, against the displacement, resisting displacements, are insurgent experiments confronting the dead but dominant neoliberal urban policy. Thank you. I don't know if we have time to, please.
Thank you very much for your splendid talk and for the work that you have done as a rapporteur. I'm going to solicit from you more hope, if at all possible. You gave us a few examples at the end of your presentation, but since we're composed of many students and professors here that want to make a difference in the world, I'm wondering, in your many travels around the world, you have brought us a lot of evidence on how this commodification and financialization of housing is creating havoc. Mm-hmm. But what are those cracks that you just mentioned? What are those openings? And particularly, did you see some places, some instances in which synergies between governments or decision makers and the people have been created? I'm particularly interested in Latin America, but from elsewhere it would be okay. For example, in Venezuela or other countries, left-leaning in Latin America. What is the Gran Misión Vivienda, the grand housing mission, doing, if anything, that is different from the panorama that you presented?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that we have, fortunately, the subprime crisis and then the financial crisis and the economic downturn that came afterward was an opportunity in many, many countries of rethinking the policy. Also, we have a generational issue, and I see this very clearly in Europe. For a lot in Britain, for instance, for the generation of the working class that used to live in public housing and had opportunity to buy their houses in a very cheap amount, for them was perfect. And they became the very base for Margaret Thatcher and for the neoliberal policies, because yes, they won their houses. But then for their children, despite being college educated, they are not able to get access to any housing, especially in London and southeastern England. It's very expensive. They are not able even to pay the rent. There is no rent options. So, and this is also true in all the socialist countries, where during privatization, those who were living in the apartments, they remained there. So nobody was homeless. But then, these people are not stuck. They have children. They have grandchildren. Now the children and grandchildren have not the opportunities to have access. So taking this thing, plus all the organizations and the movements of the people who were in debt, and in Spain, for instance, the movement that started with Plataforma de los Hipotecados were able, including as part of a big coalition, of creating a new party, which is challenging the policy as a whole, the policy of Spain as a whole. In Greece, the same thing. That happened, the same thing. So there is a political movement of resisting and rethinking, which is something important, because we were talking about something that it was almost everybody following the same path and no way to go out from there, out of the box. So this is important issues that are happening today in Europe as well. But also in Latin America, I see there is a very important alternative model that is being in place by chance in Uruguay, since we are here in Uruguay. In Uruguay, and you have cooperative housing. Cooperative housing, which is very interesting because you have security of tenure, but the house and the complex does not belong to individuals. They belong to a cooperative. And somebody can enter and go out and in the cooperative and pass to another person who needs a house. But in a way, the cooperative housing is protected by from speculative attacks. In the US and Britain as well, we have community land trusts. The community land trusts are more or less the same thing. So you have some spaces, real spaces and policies. In Uruguay, the government backs cooperative housing, provides public lands to the cooperatives in order to them to be able to build the cooperative home there. You can use also the example of Venezuela, although I show that Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Colombia, they are all going to the same path of massive production in the peripheries, as is shown. Venezuela's Gran Misión Vivienda is quite different because basically, with the regulatory system of land planning, they were able, with eminent domain, without paying in the eminent domain the market value of the land, they were able to mobilize central located land in order to build housing and social housing. And they have put a lot of money into that in apartments which has much more quality than those houses that I have shown to you. But the problem with Gran Misión Vivienda, as well as with other programs and social programs in Venezuela, is that they are 100% oil dependent. And as the oil price is going down, Gran Misión Vivienda will disappear. Because it's really a lot of money, and a lot of money, some of them are cooperative, but very few. And most of them are home ownership. So that means that you are putting a lot of public money into individual ownership. So the money will disappear someday. Will end someday. So, but still, you have some differences. Having said that, you have also interesting experiences on urbanization of informal settlement at the same time. In Colombia, in Brazil, are two examples, two countries that have experimented indeed, in practice, how to urbanize in situ for the people who are there. So there are some interesting and good examples of the feasibilities of that and the possibilities of that. So what I see is more some examples of cooperative housing, which are still alive, and also some examples of informal settlements upgrading and urbanizing who are still in place. But in the case of Brazil, for instance, unfortunately, with the launching of the program Minha Casa Minha Vida, these experiments of urbanizing favelas, they almost stopped. And everything became Minha Casa Minha Vida. So it's sad. You?
Oh.
The mic. She.
My question is actually related
Okay.
to her comment, or my comments related to this. So I appreciate very much your international examples, but if I could add to that, a local example, actually a mile and a half from here and the Lower East Side.
Yeah.
I just yesterday visited what's called the Museum for Reclaimed Urban Spaces, and it's a great opportunity to learn about the history. It's kind of a radical history of the Lower East Side, very interesting history. So the museum itself is in a squat that has become more formal, like a formal agreement with the government to maintain its ownership, and there's still about 10 squats in that community. And this museum documents that history, as well as the history of urban gardens, which is a similar kind of project. And so there's kind of two opportunities to learn about how you can make a local impact. Also, kind of related to NYU, where we are, there's a former, it was kind of it was an abandoned building, a former school that became a community center, and up until 2001, when it was closed down and sold to private developers, they were going to build fancy condominiums on it. They fought for many years. To this day, it's still abandoned. But actually, NYU is now trying to build student housing there. So it's you know, to like as constituents of the NYU community, whether you're students or just here, I think that's an opportunity to get involved, and because that's not like the final nails on that coffin haven't been driven. It's actually you know, very possible to turn the political tide back, especially with the new administration and the government, to maybe reopen the community center. So that to kind of as students, here are some concrete ways to either educate yourself or get involved locally.
Thank
And
you.
actually, I would love to hear your comments as an alum of the
No, thank you.
school
Thank you
here.
for no, it's very good because and thank you for bringing that, because it's interesting also to understand what's going on with these squatter buildings that I just I have show you. And I remember when I lived here, when I did my PhD here in NYU, and I lived in the Lower East Side, and it was early 80s. And the Lower East Side was absolutely torn down, and there was a lot of initiatives of community gardens, of cooperative housing, taking over the places and trying to renew and reform and care of the places. There are still some spots that remained over this, and I think that the museum that you just yeah, it's part of this story. So basically, if you see this movement, this squad, which is not only in São Paulo, many cities in Brazil now, at the same time, they have this type of occupation in two lines, which is very important: occupation of public space, appropriation of public space, abandoned public space, or a public space, contested public space. For instance, there is a big movement in a square to transform it into a park instead of being a new private development with some towers, or another movements that are trying to retake in the city the idea that the commonalities or the commons should be the base for planning, which means commons means public spaces, including sidewalks, including bike lanes, including social equipments, community centers, community libraries, community gardens. That should be the base for city planning, and not unlock land value. So those values of using the city as the values, and the way to do that, one, okay, I want a public space. The other is creating public space. Going there, using directly, occupying, using, transforming, in what we call in an insurgent urbanism that does and transform. And this is very important because at the same time is sending a message, a political message, but at the same time is experimenting a new way of organizing space, of being there, and this is very important. In terms of housing also, we have both situations. Some groups and some movements occupy empty buildings in order to press to get access to housing elsewhere, to get into the list of housing elsewhere. Some groups occupy buildings in order to stay there, or occupy land in order to stay there. To stay there and ask for support in terms of the public housing policy to let them stay there, renew the building and all that. So I think it's a double thing, and it's very important. And I know that this is not only in Brazilian cities today, but in many cities as well.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. And I wanted to know what your thoughts are on the role of two questions, maybe a couple more, of universities within late capitalism and neoliberal warfare, and about what you think about NYU or other enormous private universities that are amongst the largest landowners in this
Yeah.
city. I'm not well traveled at all, but I do know that in this city the largest landowners are not billionaires, they're not investors, they're not people investing in empty apartments, they're universities. And they're private research universities, New York University and Columbia.
Mhm.
And I would like to know what you think about that.
No, you are absolutely right. It's important. NYU and Columbia has been not only now but always very important real estate agents in the city, shaping the market, also the real estate market with their undertakings. But in New York, particularly, the presence of hedge funds, equity funds, merge with the university. The university is not pure university. The university is also part of this financial circuit. Who owns the university today? And who owns real estate today? They are not anymore individual owners of buildings, which was the traditional real estate in New York. Is all of these buildings, including the ones that are managed by the university, are owned by investment funds, globalized investment funds. And now they are entering also into the rental sector and buying all the subprime houses, bunches of subprime houses, especially in states like California. This is huge today, and renew them and renting them out, of course, with the expectation of the appreciation of value over time after the crack is over, the crash is over. And this is not only in the US, this is happening also in Germany. Hedge funds and investment funds had bought large tranches of public housing in eastern Germany, in places that lost completely their industrial jobs, so they were completely empty. They bought for nothing this real estate and they bought for nothing and then waiting for appreciation afterwards. And this is the new, so some of the agents that provoked the subprime crisis now are organizing investment funds to buy the subprime empty buildings. This is what is happening now. So it's, again, another circle of and New York is especially important for them. Having said that, it's incredible on how much you have still in New York some part of the stabilized rent stock and people living here, and how much you have still public housing in New York. And this, of course, has to do with a lot of struggle of New Yorkers for decades here, resisting to that. This is very important. But at the same time, you see that this has been dismantled, especially because all the schemes of rent protection that we had in New York from the 70s and the schemes of affordable housing, they had a deadline of 30 years, and they are finishing now. So I think the future is very, very worrying. What's going to happen with that? And it's very, when I started to work on that, my main question was, but I cannot understand why an investment fund will be owner of thousands of apartments in Dubai, in New York, in Moscow, in Rio, in Sao Paulo. What are they going to do with that? Who's going to rent those things? Who's going to buy those things? It's not important. Because for the financial circuit, the use is not important. It's an asset. It has to be on the books in order to leverage credit. So it's absolutely irrelevant if nobody lives there. So I think this is very important for us to understand, because all this empty stock, you would assume that if you have so much empty stock, the prices will go down, everybody will get in, and everybody will be happy forever. No. No, the prices don't go down, they won't be sold. Okay, I don't know, maybe we can merge some questions because of time. I don't know how much time we have. Oh, good. So let's merge.
Try my best. Thank you so much. I thought one of the most interesting things about your talk was your emphasis on this need to accommodate informal sort of housing solutions in kind of a creative and dynamic way. And I thought that was particularly interesting because you've been the special rapporteur on behalf of a human right to adequate housing. And I guess my suspicion of that is that human rights is a kind of legalistic framework, right? And I think a lot of the problem here, financially conceived subprime schemes and whatever, they're very much enshrined in legal formalistic terms, right? Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about the tensions between a human rights framework and kind of like how do you use that to accommodate these kind of contextual, creative, dynamic solutions that we would need on the ground for informal settlements to be integrated?
Let's get some questions so we can merge them.
Oh,
hello.
I just have a quick comment, and it's in regards to the buyouts from the Mitchell-Lamas in the city of New York. And we were doing some research on it, and we found out that the funding is being floated by the City Investment Fund, which is the City and State Employees Pension and Retirement Fund.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you can share with us some of, your experience from the UN, if some of your observations were taking account in the countries. What is the role of a multilateral actor? And it has some power or it's just symbolic, and actually if in your observations, what is the role of other kind of multilateral or transnational platforms that are emerging? If you can share some of those.
Yeah, let me get those three, otherwise it will be too much. And I will do quickly so we can have a chance of another round. First of all, the rapporteur, the role of the rapporteur is to report, basically. Have no power to change anything. Report to the Human Rights Council, which is a UN body, the countries. And it's independent from the country, so does not represent any country. It's independent, and this is the strength. The strength is that the rapporteur can come and say, this is a violation, and that exposes the country to its peers, basically. What happened afterwards? Nothing, basically. You name and shame. Naming and shaming. The multilateral and UN bodies, they function in a much more geopolitical logic. So it's like the bloc of emerging countries against the developed countries, the non-aligned with the aligned. So it's a completely different logic. It's a completely different logic. But having said that, for those people who are suffering violations in their lives, the fact that somebody from the UN come and say, you are right, and I'm going to tell you, everybody, that you are right, it's very important, because that empowers who is struggling and trying to resist. And this is very, very important. Because we are talking about people who are very vulnerable, who are voiceless, who is not here in their own country. So I see the rapporteur, and after finish my mandate, this is the feeling that I have, that the rapporteur, what the rapporteur can do is a kind of echo the voices of those who are being violated and opening ground sometimes for negotiations. And I have witnessed many, many occasions where the intervention of the rapporteur opened ground for negotiation, even in Rio during the mega event preparation. In the beginning, the city of Rio was coming to the settlement and said, go away, ciao, and give a check of $1,000 and that's it. But now it's not like that anymore because of the international exposure of the question. So this is part of the game. But if you take, I am not a lawyer. I am architect and planner. And in the beginning I said, what am I doing here with these lawyers here in the UN talking in legalistic terms? I'm completely lost here. But then I realized that the elements of the right to adequate housing are very concrete elements. Because the definition, what is a right? Everybody was asking me, what is adequate housing? How many square meters has an adequate housing? It's not this. Adequate housing, in terms of human rights, it's a portal, a point of entry by which an individual, a household or a community can access other human rights. The human right to education, to human right to health, the human right to freedom of expression, to freedom of cultural expression. So that is the definition. And it depends completely on the context. But the checklist is, in this house, the family and the household who is living here, in this location, in this condition, is able to access other human rights or not. Good health conditions, good, so this is the question. And we never compare one country to the other. We always compare one country with itself, because the idea is a progressive realization of the right to adequate housing, which means you never go backwards like you are going here in the US, in the UK, in Europe. You always go on a little bit, step by step, but bettering the conditions of the residents and not worsening, even in conditions of fiscal crisis and so on. And thank you for bringing this idea of Mitchell-Lama schemes, because not only Mitchell-Lama, which is one of the schemes that provided funds to affordable housing in New York, came from the workers, but normally most of the housing finance comes from compulsory savings of the workers themselves, which is very perverse. Which is very perverse, because the workers financing for themselves. So let's get just the last questions.
So I have a brief question. So a lot of the things you mentioned are models from the developing world, but they have the urban form of the kind of typical American suburb in all of its problematic ways. So it's kind of the urban form. It's one family, one home, but it's also very far from the urban core. And I'm wondering if you think that this model still has some kind of currency, whether it's cultural or political. What's sustaining the American suburb model, and why is it taking on so many new incarnations in the developing world?
Let's take another question. Very good question. Okay, you can stay 2 hours here. Everybody can raise up. If Gianpaolo left.
Yeah, just really quickly, I wanted to know some policy prescriptions that a city can do in order to ensure affordable and adequate housing. You mentioned occupations and reclamations, but those are anecdotal and can't support millions of people. You mentioned public housing, but those have loads of problems within themselves with access and conditions thereof. And then you also, there was one other thing you said. Well, I'll leave it at that.
Hello. I wanted to know your opinion on as we talk about mixed income neighborhoods, as kind of like I think that like seems to be like everyone puts that out as a solution. But I often see that those are the development of a poor neighborhood being completely demolished and then built up, and there's not really any type of penetration to more affluent neighborhoods. So I just wonder like your opinion on class as we talk about like the redevelopment of neighborhoods. Just because it seems that we don't touch the affluent neighborhoods, but we only continue to break down lower income neighborhoods.
Hi, thank you. I'm excited. I work with a student-led think tank, and we're attempting to develop alternatives to gentrification. I want to know how you would conceptualize this idea of a right to housing in America, because it's really against our history, our DNA, and how do I, as someone who writes or copy and tries to communicate this, how do I not sound like a communist when I'm saying you have a right to this? And especially in neighborhoods like she was talking about, that where I live in Bed-Stuy, where we have $4 million brownstones next to where I live, which is a dilapidated, brownstone, and how do we create a community that works for everyone?
Last one.
Does the UN Human Rights investigations into housing consider the predicament of people with certain disabilities in which the house itself becomes the problem, why you are trapped, or why you can't have a life, or why you are more dependent on other people than you would otherwise be, which may be a matter of you at birth you needed certain things, or you aged into a condition in which you've acquired disabilities in the course of living, and then the house becomes the problem, and then you have to be pushed into something else because you can't stay in that house because the house was designed poorly in a way that for peanuts it could have been designed better, but if you go back and upgrade it, that would be too much money.
Yeah, this is a big, just starting with this is a big issue because in many countries, including developed countries, the population is aging. The population age is higher and higher and higher, and then there is, of course, absolutely special needs that cannot be met with the type of housing that we have, with the type of city that we have. It's not just a matter of housing, but also of cities, and linking that with the idea of suburbs. I think we are living in a crisis of the model, the suburban model, but also the crisis of the city based on cars, basically. The city based on cars, and the city based on the idea of permanent expansion, horizontal expansion, which is absolutely unsustainable anymore because of the question of energy efficiency, because of consumption of space, because of many questions. So we are living in a moment where this a new thinking on cities is needed. The problem is that the whole administrative, legal, regulatory systems that we have, planning systems, both in developed country and non-developed one, are completely based on this old city that does not fit anymore in our needs, but it's still there. And there is a huge inertia of the logic. And this inertia, it's not because people are stupid, they don't know, but because we have huge coalitions of economic interests behind those schemes that had governed cities for decades. So I'm talking about, and of course, the questions that you were raised, I mean, what would be the policies? What would be the counter policies to that, and this is a very important question, we have to understand that behind the city that we have a certain coalition of power, of economic interest, and and it's impossible, we have this expression in Portuguese, it's impossible to make an omelette without breaking the eggs. So in order to do the new omelette, for the needs that we have, we need to break power relations. And I mean, we are talking, and that's what I wanted to make clear during my talk, we are talking the political economy of urban and housing. This is what we are talking about. And we have to change the political economy of urban and housing. Having said that, the main issue for affordable housing in the city today, I think, is the question of land. The problem of housing is not shelter, is floor, is land. Is land because the question is, if you take housing as a shelter, you can do whatever you want without the city. But if you take housing as a part of the city fabric, then you start thinking from the city fabric. Colombia has a very interesting experiment on this regard on low-income housing in a new neighborhood where instead of providing the houses, they have provided only the infrastructure. No houses at all, but very nice sidewalks, library, school, bike lanes, and for the car, non-paved street. But very good sidewalks, paved sidewalks, with lighting, with water system, with everything. So for the people who are pedestrians, who use bike, who use public transportation, it's very good, and it's possible for them to do their houses in these places, because the problem of the inadequacy of the informal settlements is not the houses. It's the fact that they are built over a non-developed land. So I would say the most important policy would be to develop land and to open it for those who need. Developed land, not housing. Developed with everything that a city needs. And last question on mixed income. I know that the mixed income policy, not only in the US, but also in France, mixité sociale, came in order to face these massive ghettos of public housing, which was very homogeneous and created a barrier between the residents and the community. So the idea of mixing different incomes, different type of people in the same place is a beautiful idea. But there is a problem here, because the real experiment of mixed income, at least those who I have visited around, were you had 300 people living in a building. You turn down, you take out those 300 people, and then you take 30 out of them back to this place in order to mix with newcomers. And what's going to happen with the 170? That's the problem. So I think that, again, the idea of mixing, and not only mixing different incomes, but also mixing different functions, not only housing, but housing mixed with commercial space, with office space, with all these kind of things, it's very important. It's a new thinking, it's a new trend on that. But it's very important to know why and for whom you should do the policy. The ones that need the policy are the ones who are more vulnerable, and not the ones who have more money. Those who have more money can have many, many options. The problem are the ones who don't have options. And it's very important for them to have one. I think that.
Thank you.
Thank you.